Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video lesson. Today we are going to look at lesson 1.08. It's called On the Brink, and this video lesson is going to focus on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, in today's lesson, we're going to sort of not talk about the entire Cuban Missile Crisis, but rather we are going to focus on what caused the Cuban Missile Crisis, how it started, and the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union during this time. And then in the next lesson, what we are going to focus on is how the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. And there's a reason that I broke this up into two different lessons. And if you stay tuned to the next couple of lessons or the next couple of days in Class Connect, you will see why I divided it up this way. It has to do with a little activity that you are going to be doing. So today, like I said, we are going to be focused on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and by the end of today, or the end of this lesson, the end of the next couple lessons, you should be able to describe the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So first, I sort of wanted to show you the differences between the two leaders of the superpowers during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Remember, the Cold War lasts 44 years, so as you have been able to see over some of the past lessons and going forward, you'll definitely be able to see it more, that there are a number of leaders for both the United States and the Soviet Union throughout those 44 years. So at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the president of the United States is President John F. Kennedy, and the premier of the Soviet Union is Nikita Khrushchev. And there are differences between these two men, not only in what they believe, but also visually. There are differences between these men. So just a little bit of comparing, it's actually more contrasting these two men. John F. Kennedy was young. He was only 44 years old at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was tall. He was very handsome. He grew up wealthy. He went to the best schools. He was polished and sophisticated, and he wanted to contain communism. Now, Nikita Khrushchev, on the other hand, he was older. He was 67 years old at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was short. He was plump. He grew up poor. He left school to work in a factory. He was also unpolished, where John F. Kennedy was polished and sophisticated. He displayed a temper, and he wanted to spread communism. However, even though we have these two differences between these two leaders, now you don't actually have to know how old they were or what they looked like or anything. I sort of wanted to give you the visual of the differences between the two. One thing that both leaders wanted throughout the time that they were leaders of their countries during the Cold War, and also specifically during the Cuban Missile Crisis, is that both leaders wanted to avoid nuclear war. Remember, the United States and the Soviet Union had nuclear capabilities, and if one of them would have used a nuclear weapon somewhere in the world, the other superpower was more than likely going to retaliate, and then this would have led to that MAD that we have talked about before, that mutually assured destruction, not only of the two superpowers, but probably of the planet itself, had nuclear war started during the Cold War. So one thing that both of these leaders wanted to do was to avoid nuclear war. If anyone has seen the movie 13 Days, it's not that old. It was made in 2000, and yes, it is in color. A lot of times when we talk about movies in history, some of them aren't in color, but this one is in color. It describes the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis and what it was like to be in Kennedy's inner circle of people during those 13 days. So if you have seen the movie, or if the Cuban Missile Crisis is something that you are interested in, it is a good movie and really does describe what it was like during those 13 days. It's rated either PG or PG-13, I'm not sure. But if it is something that you are interested in, maybe ask your parents if you can watch it. You can probably borrow it from your local library. It's probably there. So 13 Days, it does star Kevin Costner. But it is about the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, a little background about Cuba. You did just go over this in a previous lesson, but it's always good to do a little review to sort of remind ourselves how we got to where we are. So, why this focus on Cuba? Why was there a missile crisis in Cuba? Well, remember that Cuba is a small island that's only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. It was a U.S. ally. It was a place where U.S. businesses were based, and the United States has a military base there, Guantanamo Bay. In 1959, Fidel Castro, remember, overthrew Batista, who was the U.S.-backed dictator, and established a communist government there. And because of that communist government that was established there, in January of 1961, the U.S. broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba. Now, just in 2015, President Obama reestablished those diplomatic relations with Cuba after there had been no diplomatic relationships between the United States and Cuba since January of 1961. But that did change in 2016 with President Obama. In the autumn of 1962, so about a year and a half after the United States broke off those diplomatic relations with Cuba because they had established a communist government, Cuba received thousands of missiles, jets, boats, and personnel from the Soviet Union. So remember, this is all during the Cold War, that idea of containing communism that the United States wanted to do, or spreading communism, what the Soviet Union wanted to do. Remember, it all sort of goes back to that idea of containing or spreading communism or capitalism, depending on what side of the Cold War you were on. So why was the Soviet Union interested in helping Cuba? Cuba is a new communist state. Remember that the Soviet Union wants to spread communism. Cuba provided a launch base for Soviet intercontinental missiles near the United States. Remember, they're only 90 miles off the coast of the United States. Khrushchev also wanted to test the strength of John F. Kennedy, who was the new and very young U.S. president. And Khrushchev wanted to force JFK into bargaining over U.S. missiles in Europe. So Cuba was picked for very strategic reasons, but also that idea of wanting to be able to bargain over U.S. missiles in Europe. The United States had nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey that were pointed at the Soviet Union. So here is the country of Turkey, where the U.S. had those nuclear missiles pointed at the Soviet Union. Remember, Russia is part of the Soviet Union, so you can see that it's very close where the U.S. had their missiles based. So Khrushchev decided to put missiles in Cuba, again, only 90 miles off the coast of the United States, in order to retaliate against that and hopefully have a bargaining chip to get the United States to remove their missiles that were stationed in Turkey. So in October of 1962, President Kennedy found out that nuclear missile sites were under construction in Cuba. Construction was just days away from completion, so when they found out about the missiles, they weren't actually completed yet. They were still under construction, but experts thought that they could be completed in only the next 7 days. So they found out about the construction about 7 days before they would be able to be completed. And once construction was finished, the missiles would be able to strike the United States with little or no warning. So the missiles stationed in Cuba would easily be able to reach the United States with little or no warning. So the United States found out about the missiles in Cuba because a United States U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba took pictures of the sites. The U.S. spy plane also identified 220 Soviet ships that were bound for Cuba carrying the missiles. So some of the materials to construct the missiles were in Cuba being used constructing those missile sites, and then there was more materials on their way from the Soviet Union to Cuba. The U-2 spy plane that took pictures of the missile sites, that is the event that marked the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So a United States spy plane photographed the Soviet missile sites in Cuba. And one thing to keep in mind while we're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is the Soviet Union that is constructing the missiles in Cuba. Cuba and the Soviet Union are allies with each other, but it's not Cuba's decision to put these missiles there aimed at the United States. It's a decision of the Soviet Union to do that. So here, this is a primary source document. It is an actual photograph. This is a U-2 reconnaissance photo that showed concrete evidence of missile assembly in Cuba. Shown here are missile transporters and missile-ready tents where fueling and maintenance took place. Here are some other photographs as well. showing the missile sites. And then again down here, here are some missile sites. And then here is one of those ships, one of those 220 ships that were en route from the Soviet Union to Cuba at the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So if missiles were launched from Cuba, how far into the United States could they reach? Remember, the United States is only 90 miles away from Cuba, so what does that mean in terms of how far these nuclear missiles, if launched by the Soviet Union, could reach into the United States? Well, here is a map of the United States and Cuba, Canada and Mexico as well. And you can see that here is Havana. Remember the Bay of Pigs invasion? The Bay of Pigs is on the south side of the island of Cuba. Here is Havana, the capital of Cuba, with the various launch sites around Cuba. There were both short-range and long-range missiles that were based in Cuba. The short-range missiles could have reached anywhere within this arc of this arc that's on the map. So it covers much of the southern United States. It doesn't quite reach Washington, D.C., but it does cover much of the southern United States as well as the Gulf of Mexico, part of Mexico and the Bahamas as well. In addition to that, there were also long-range missiles there, and the long-range missiles could reach most of the cities, the large cities within the United States, so places like Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, Denver, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and almost the entire country of Mexico could be reached by these long-range Soviet missiles that were based in Cuba. So you can see how this was a big deal, how much of the United States could be destroyed by these missiles if Nikita Khrushchev would have chosen to launch them and use them from their base in Cuba. So now we know how the crisis began with that U-2 spy plane. We know why the Cuban Missile Crisis sort of started, or why the Soviet Union sent missiles to Cuba. It was to have that bargaining chip and that retaliation for the U.S. missiles that were located in Turkey. But what we don't know exactly is how this is going to end. I will give you a little bit of a hint. It does not end in nuclear war. So that's a little bit of a hint. We're all still here. No nuclear war happened. But in the next couple of lessons, either lessons or class connects, we are going to find out exactly what President Kennedy did to deal with the crisis and how the Cuban Missile Crisis was eventually brought to an end. So if you do have any questions about why the Cuban Missile Crisis started, what the Cuban Missile Crisis was, please let me know. But then I'll leave you with that little cliffhanger of what was President Kennedy to do, knowing that missiles in Cuba could reach most of the United States if they were launched by the Soviet Union. So it's my little cliffhanger for this lesson. Stay tuned and make sure you come back tomorrow to find out how exactly Kennedy deals with the Cuban Missile Crisis, how Nikita Khrushchev reacts, and how the 13 days in October of the Cuban Missile Crisis come to an end.